My name is June Collard. I'm 39 years old, and on a Thursday evening in October, a woman I had never met rang my doorbell with 2 children at her side and a look on her face that told me she had spent a very long time working up the courage to do exactly this. She introduced herself as Daphne. She said she needed to talk to me about my husband. I told her I knew. I told her to come inside. I put the kettle on. The expression on her face when I said those words, "I know, come inside," is not something I will forget. It was the expression of a woman who had prepared herself for a confrontation and arrived to find that the war she expected had already been concluded, quietly, in a room she had never been admitted to, by a woman who had spent 8 months building the case before the other side knew there was a case to build. I want to be clear about something before I tell you this story. Daphne was not my enemy. She was not a villain. She was a woman who had been lied to, the same way I had been lied to, by the same man using the same tools, the same charm, the same carefully calibrated version of himself, the same ability to maintain 2 separate realities without appearing to inhabit either one fully. She had come to my door because she had children and questions and nowhere else to take them. The courage that took, I have never underestimated. What neither she nor my husband Marcus knew was that by the time she rang that doorbell, I had been working with a forensic attorney for 4 months. I had a complete accounting of our marital assets. I had documentation of every transfer, every account, every property, every financial decision Marcus had made during our 9-year marriage that had been made with the money I earned as much as the money he earned and had been structured with quiet, deliberate care to keep me from knowing what I was actually owed. I had everything I needed. I had been waiting for the right moment to use it. Daphne coming to my door was not the beginning of the end of my marriage. She was the final piece of a story I had already written. Welcome back to Silent Daughter Stories, where quiet people finally tell the truth. If someone in your life has ever mistaken your calm for ignorance, this story is for you. Drop a comment, subscribe, and let me take you back to Knoxville, Tennessee, and the evening I found the first anomaly in a bank statement that a smarter man would have made sure I never saw. I want to start with what I do for a living, because it is the context for everything that follows, and because Marcus knew what I did for a living when he married me and either believed he was smarter than I was or believed that love was a sufficient reason for me not to pay attention. He was wrong on both counts. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my professional life examining financial records for evidence of things that people have tried to conceal: fraud, embezzlement, hidden assets in divorce proceedings, money moved in ways designed to be invisible to everyone except someone who knows exactly what to look for. I've been doing this work for 12 years. I am, without false modesty, very good at it. I have testified in court proceedings in 4 states. I have found money that people were certain was unfindable. My husband was a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company. He traveled 2 weeks out of every 4. He was charming and organized and had the particular quality of a man who understood that the most effective way to manage people was to make them feel understood and chosen, which is a professional skill that translates, in a marriage, into something that takes a long time to recognize as management rather than love. I recognized it eventually. I recognized it the way I recognize most things, not through emotion first, but through the numbers. The first anomaly was a $17 discrepancy in a grocery store charge that appeared twice on our joint account in the same weekend, once in Knoxville, where I had been, and once in Chattanooga, where Marcus had said he was visiting a client. I noticed it the way I notice all discrepancies, as a professional reflex, the automatic flagging of something that doesn't add up. I did not confront him. I made a note in the small blue ledger I keep for personal financial records, the one I have carried since my first job, because my Aunt Cecile told me when I was 22 that the most important thing a woman can do is keep her own numbers, always, regardless of who else is keeping them. I wrote down the date, the amount, the location, and a question mark. Then I kept paying attention. The paying attention took 8 months. I want to give you the shape of those 8 months because the shape of them is the whole story. They were not 8 months of crying or confrontation or the particular melodrama of a woman discovering her husband is not who she thought. They were 8 months of quiet, methodical documentation by a woman who understood, from her professional life, that the difference between suspicion and proof is a very large distance, and that crossing it requires patience, precision, and the willingness to sit with what you know before you decide what to do about it. Marcus was good. I want to give him that. He had compartmentalized his 2 lives with the same organization he brought to his professional one. Separate accounts I wasn't aware of, a phone I had never seen, a pattern of travel that was plausible enough that I had not questioned it in 9 years of marriage. He had not been careless because he was arrogant or stupid. He had been careless because he had come to believe, after 9 years, that I was not looking. He thought he knew me. He thought the woman who came home from her professional life analyzing other people's concealed finances and cooked dinner and asked about his week and seemed, to all appearances, content with the version of their marriage she had been given was not also the woman who ran the same analytical process on their own life that she ran every day on her clients. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong about it for 8 months, during which time I had found the second account, the property in Chattanooga he had purchased 3 years into our marriage, in a name that was not quite his, but was close enough to trace with basic corporate records. The transfers that had been moving money from our joint assets in amounts small enough not to trigger automatic alerts accumulated over 6 years to a sum of $112,000. I had found Daphne's name in the 4th month on a utility account connected to the Chattanooga property. I had found the children's names in the 6th month in a school registration document that was part of the property's address history. 2 children, 7 and 4. The older one had been born 18 months into our marriage. I sat with that fact for 3 days before I was ready to continue working. It was the only time in 8 months that I stopped. 3 days, and then I opened the ledger and kept going because the work was the thing I knew how to do. And the work was the thing that was going to get me out. You're too analytical, June. You overthink everything. Marcus had said this to me so many times over 9 years that it had become a kind of ambient sound in our marriage, present so consistently that I had stopped hearing it as a sentence and heard it only as a temperature, the normal climate of a house where one person's way of processing the world was treated as an inconvenience by the other. He meant it as a critique. He did not know he was describing the exact quality that was going to dismantle him. I want to give you the full texture of those 8 months because the summary, she documented, she waited, she acted, does not capture what it actually costs to know something and hold it. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being the only person in a room who knows the true version of events. I have experienced it professionally, in depositions and court proceedings where I hold documentation that will eventually dismantle a carefully maintained fiction, and I have learned that the loneliness is not a problem to solve, but a condition to manage. You hold the knowledge. You carry it as cleanly as possible. You do not let it leak into the ordinary surfaces of your life before you are ready. I was less practiced at managing it personally. Evenings were the hardest. Marcus would come home from a real trip or a Chattanooga trip. I could usually tell the difference by the 3rd month, from small calibrations in his behavior that I won't enumerate here because they are his tells, and identifying them would serve no purpose now. And we would have dinner and talk about the week and watch something on television, and I would sit across from him holding 8 months of a case the way you hold a full glass in a crowded room, very still, very careful, not spilling. The blue ledger lived in my work bag. I had not told Marcus I kept a personal financial ledger, which was itself information, because in 9 years of marriage I had somehow never mentioned to a man who knew I was a forensic accountant that I kept a small blue notebook with our financial records in my own handwriting. Either he had not thought to ask, or he had not wanted to know. I suspected the latter. I added entries in the evenings after he fell asleep. Dates, amounts, account numbers, cross-references to the primary documents I was photographing with my work phone before returning them to exactly where I had found them. I had learned this from 12 years of practice. The evidence always has a home. Return it to its home. The subject should never know you are looking until you are ready for them to know. Marcus never knew I was looking. He had been married to a forensic accountant for 9 years, and he had never once considered that she might be paying the same quality of attention to his life that she paid to her clients. This is the part I have thought about the most in the months since the divorce. Not the betrayal, which I had processed during the 8 months of working, but the specific shape of his miscalculation. He had married someone who finds hidden things for a living and had then hidden things. He had told her for 9 years that she was too analytical, that she overthought things, that her way of processing the world was a flaw. And he had apparently believed this framing enough to act on it, to rely on it, to build a 7-year second life on the assumption that his forensic accountant wife was, when it came to their own marriage, not paying attention. I have come to understand this as the particular blindness of a man who needed his wife to be less than she was, and so decided she was. People do this. They decide you are smaller than you are because the alternative, accepting what you actually are, requires too much adjustment to the story they've been telling about who they are in relation to you. Marcus needed me to be manageable, to be someone whose precision was an inconvenience rather than a skill. He had spent 9 years working very hard to convince me of this, and he had partially succeeded, which is the part I'm still working on in therapy on alternate Tuesdays. Partially. He had succeeded partially. Not enough to matter in the end. Aunt Cecile is 70, retired, and spent 30 years as a paralegal in a family law practice. She is the person I called in the 3rd month on a Sunday afternoon from my car in a parking lot 2 miles from my house because I needed to tell someone what I knew, and I needed that someone to be a person who understood both the legal and the emotional landscape of what I was walking into. She listened without interrupting. She asked 4 questions. She said, "You need a forensic attorney, not a family lawyer, someone who can work in parallel with the financial documentation you're building. Don't move anything, don't tip him off, and don't stop documenting." "I know," I said. "I know you know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway because some part of you is probably hoping you're wrong, and I need the part of you that knows you're right to stay in charge." Cecile has always been the person in my life who understood the difference between what I felt and what I knew, and who trusted me to manage both without losing either one. She had watched me be told for 9 years that I was too analytical, too precise, too much in my head. She had watched me absorb that assessment the way you absorb any assessment that comes from the person you love, not fully believing it, not fully dismissing it, carrying it as a question about yourself that you haven't yet answered. She had always known the answer. "You're not too analytical," she told me in the parking lot on that Sunday afternoon. He married a forensic accountant and then spent 9 years trying to convince her that paying attention was a character flaw. That tells you everything about what he was doing with the time she wasn't paying attention. I drove home and made dinner and asked Marcus about his week and sat across from him at the table we had bought together 7 years earlier and felt the cold, clear quality of a person who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. If you have ever had to sit across from someone who was lying to you while you held the proof in your hands and waited for the right moment, drop Blue Ledger in the comments. Subscribe right now, because the evening Daphne rang my doorbell was the moment I had been preparing for, and I want you to understand exactly what preparation looks like when it's done right. I knew she was coming before she arrived. Not the specific date, not the specific Thursday, but the general shape of it. I had been monitoring the situation in Chattanooga through the documentation and through 2 conversations with my attorney, who had told me in September that the financial picture was complete and asked me how I wanted to proceed. I had said, "I want to wait. There's something unresolved." She had asked, "What?" "I think he's going to have to make a choice soon," I said, "and I think when he does, one of them is going to come to me. I want to be ready when that happens." My attorney had looked at me across her desk with the expression of a woman who has been doing this work for 20 years and has seen a great many things. And she had said, "You're the calmest client I've had in 2 decades. I'm a forensic accountant," I said. "I close cases. This is a case." What I did not tell her was that the calm was not the absence of feeling. It was the presence of preparation. The difference between those two things is the distance between a person who is numb and a person who has done the work. And I want you to understand that I had done the work. Not just the financial work, not just the legal work, but the other kind. The kind you do at 3 in the morning when the case files are closed and the blue ledger is on the nightstand and you are just a woman in a house that has turned out to contain a life that was never quite what she was told it was. I had done that work too. I had cried in the shower and called Cecile from parking lots and sat on the kitchen floor once for 45 minutes because the accumulation of it was simply, at that particular moment, more than I could hold upright. I had let myself feel all of it, in private, in the hours when Marcus was traveling and the house was mine. And then I had gotten up and gone back to the ledger. The evening Daphne rang the doorbell, Marcus was in Chattanooga. He had been there since Tuesday. He had called that morning to say his meetings were running long, the same thing he always said when he needed an extra day. And I had said, "That's fine, take your time," and meant it in a way he did not understand. I heard the bell at 6:47. I was in the kitchen making tea, and I heard it, and I understood, with the particular knowing of a woman who has been paying attention for 8 months, that the shape of the thing she had been waiting for had arrived at her door. I set down the kettle. I smoothed the front of my shirt. I walked to the door and opened it. Daphne was 34, dark-haired, with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying a difficult decision for a long time and has finally acted on it and is now standing on the other side of the action, not yet knowing if she did the right thing. Behind her, a boy of 7 with Marcus's eyes and a girl of 4 who had her hand in her mother's and was looking at me with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of a very young child. I had seen their names in the school registration, Eli and Harper. I had known their ages. Seeing them in person was different from knowing them on paper, and I want to be honest that the difference was not nothing. It was the only moment in the entire 8 months that the professional frame slipped entirely, and I was simply a woman looking at the evidence of the life her husband had been living 3 hours away for the past 7 years. I held it for 4 seconds. Then I held the door open. "I know," I said. "Come inside." I made tea because it was 6:47 in the evening and because some habits are load-bearing and tea was one of mine, and because I needed 30 seconds of something familiar while Daphne settled the children on the sofa with a phone showing cartoons and came to sit at my kitchen table. She looked at me across the table with an expression that was still recalibrating. She had prepared herself for denial, for anger, for a scene. She had not prepared herself for a woman who knew. "How long have you known?" she asked. 8 months. "And you didn't—" She stopped. "Why didn't you confront him?" "Because confronting him would have given him time to move the money," I said. "I'm a forensic accountant. I close cases before I open doors." She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked back at me. "How much did he move?" $112,000 from our joint accounts over 6 years. He also has a property in Chattanooga in a shell company that's worth approximately $200,000 at current market. The total documented marital asset picture is $312,000, not counting the retirement accounts he told me were underperforming. I paused. They were not underperforming. She was quiet for a long time. "He told me," she said carefully, "that you knew about the arrangement, that you had an understanding." I looked at her. "No. He said you were—" She stopped again. "He said you were aware that he had other commitments and that you preferred not to discuss it." I picked up my tea. "He told you I preferred not to discuss it?" "Yes. I'm a forensic accountant," I said. "I discuss things for a living." Something shifted in her face. A piece of the story she had been given falling away from the piece of the story she was currently sitting inside. "He told me a lot of things," she said quietly. I know he did, I said. He's very good at that. We sat in my kitchen for 2 hours. The children watched cartoons in the living room, and occasionally, Harper came to stand in the doorway and look at me with her 4-year-old's uncomplicated assessment and then go back to the sofa. Daphne told me her story, how they had met, how long it had been, what he had told her about his marriage, what she had believed, what she had begun to question, and what had finally made her get in her car and drive to Knoxville with her children on a Thursday evening. What had made her come was a document she had found in Marcus's bag 3 weeks earlier, a financial disclosure she had not been meant to see, prepared for a process she had not known was in progress. He had filed for divorce from me in September, without telling me, without serving me. He had apparently decided, in the way that men who have been managing 2 realities for 7 years occasionally decide, that the timing was right to consolidate, and he had engaged an attorney and begun the process and had not yet gotten to the part where I would have to be notified. He had told Daphne about it. He had told her they could be together properly, finally, and that the other situation was being resolved. Daphne was not a woman who wanted to be a resolution. She had driven to Knoxville to find out what she actually was. I told her what she actually was, which was a woman who had been deceived by the same man using the same methods, and who had 2 children who deserved a better accounting of the situation than their father had provided, and who had every right to be furious, and also every right to make decisions from a place of information rather than from the version of reality Marcus had been managing on her behalf. I also told her about the shell company and the property. She had not known about the property. She sat very still for a moment. He bought a house in Chattanooga and put it in a company name, I said. It's not in your name, it's not in mine. It's in a company that traces back to him through 2 layers of incorporation. My attorney found it in the 6th month. Where are we living? She asked. A rental, I said. His name on the lease. No ownership. She looked at her hands. She was putting together numbers the way I put together numbers, not emotionally, but structurally, the architecture of a thing clarifying as the pieces went in. He was going to walk away with the asset, she said. That was the intention, yes. From both of us. From both of us. Marcus came home on Saturday afternoon. I was in the kitchen when he came through the door, the same kitchen where I had sat with Daphne 2 evenings earlier, and I was doing exactly what I had been doing every Saturday afternoon for 9 years. Making coffee, reading, existing in the house in the ordinary way of a woman who lives in it. He set his bag down. He said hello. He asked about my week. Interesting, I said. He went to change out of his travel clothes. He came back down and poured coffee and sat across from me at the table, and we had the same conversation we had every Saturday. His meetings, the traffic, the weather in the other city. I let him finish his coffee. Then I put the blue ledger on the table between us. Not open. Just there. The small blue notebook I'd been keeping since the first anomaly, with its careful columns and dates and question marks and answers. 8 months of a case, closed and documented and ready. He looked at it. He looked at me. I watched him recalibrate, the way I had watched subjects and depositions recalibrate when documentation is placed in front of them, the brief, involuntary rearrangement of the face as the story they have been telling encounters the story that has been recorded. June, my attorney filed a response to your divorce petition this morning. I said, you'll receive it Monday. It includes a complete accounting of the marital assets, including the Chattanooga property, the secondary accounts, and the 6 years of transfers. The documentation is thorough. I would know. I paused. It's my job. He was very still. Daphne came to see me on Thursday, I said. We had tea. She's a reasonable person. She was lied to, the same way I was lied to, and she deserves the same quality of legal representation that I have, which is why I gave her my attorney's number before she left. Something moved across his face that was not quite fear and not quite guilt, and was the expression of a man watching 2 carefully separated realities collide in his kitchen on a Saturday afternoon. You're too analytical, he said, And I think he meant it as the accusation it had always been. The same sentence used for 9 years to suggest that the way I processed the world was a defect rather than a skill. I looked at him across our kitchen table. "Yes," I said, "I am." I let that sit for a moment. "And you married me anyway?" I said, which is the part I've been thinking about for 8 months. You knew what I did. You knew how I think. And you still believed I wouldn't find it. He had no answer for that. "That's not analytical, Marcus," I said. "That's just arrogant." I picked up the ledger. I stood up. I walked to the door of the kitchen and I stopped. "The transfers are documented back to the original accounts," I said. "All of it is traceable. All of it is in the petition. I've been doing this work for 12 years, and this is the most complete financial case I have ever built." I looked at him. "You should have hired a better accountant. I want to tell you about the Saturday afternoon in more detail because the telling of it is what most people ask about, and because I want you to understand that what happened at that table was not a performance of power. It was not revenge. It was the honest conclusion of a process, and the thing that made it feel complete was not his reaction, but the quality of my own steadiness." He sat across from me at that table for approximately 45 seconds before he understood. I watched the understanding move across his face, the way I had watched it move across the faces of subjects in depositions, the specific sequence of recognition, calculation, recalibration, and then the moment when they decide which version of themselves to present to the room. He went through the first 3 stages and then stopped at the 4th. He did not choose a version of himself, he just sat there, which was the most honest thing he had done in years, and I respected it in the way you respect a person who has finally run out of the energy to perform. "How long?" he said. 8 months. He looked at the ledger. "You kept notes." "I keep notes on everything," I said. "You've known that for 9 years. A silence. The kind that comes when someone is sitting with the thing they have finally been forced to see. "I thought," he started. "I know what you thought," I said. "You thought I wasn't looking. You thought that the same instinct you spent 9 years telling me was a problem was somehow not going to apply to you." He did not have an answer. "You told me I overthink things," I said. "You told me I was too analytical. You said it so often that I started to wonder if you were right." I paused. "I wasn't. You were just afraid of what happens when someone pays attention. This is not the conversation people want when they ask what happened at the table. They want a dramatic confrontation, a scene, the particular satisfaction of a wronged party delivering a devastating speech. What I gave him was quieter than that, and I think more permanent. I did not deliver a speech. I delivered a ledger and 4 sentences and the specific quality of a woman who had done her work and was no longer afraid of what he knew about her or what he thought of her or what story he had been telling himself about why she was less than she actually was. I was done being less. Then I walked upstairs and called Cecile and told her it was done. I want to tell you about Daphne's children because they are the part of this story that I think about most often and that I handled least well. Eli was 7. Harper was 4. They sat on my sofa watching cartoons on Daphne's phone for 2 hours while their mother and I had a conversation that would reshape the structure of their lives, and they were quiet and uncomplaining in the particular way of children who have learned, from early exposure to adult uncertainty, that being small and unobtrusive is a form of safety. I did not speak to them much that evening. I brought Harper a glass of water when she came to stand in the doorway and asked, with the directness of a 4-year-old, if we had juice. I did not have juice. I had water, and I gave it to her, and she looked at me for a moment with her father's eyes and then went back to the sofa, satisfied. I thought about them on the drive to my attorney's office the following Monday. I thought about them during the 14 months of the divorce. I thought about them when the Chattanooga property matter was being resolved, because the resolution of that matter was directly connected to their housing, and because whatever Marcus had done to the adults in this situation, the children had not done anything at all. I am not going to tell you that I made decisions in the divorce proceedings based on the children's welfare rather than on the strict terms of what I was owed. That would not be accurate, and this is an honest story. What I will tell you is that I did not pursue certain claims that I could have pursued, because the mathematics of pursuing them would have resulted in an outcome that was technically satisfying and practically destabilizing in ways that would have ultimately landed on two children who had not asked to be in this situation. Cecile, when I told her this, said, "That's not weakness." "I know," I said. "Some people would call it that. Some people would be wrong." She raised her glass. "The children are not my responsibility and are not my family, and I do not know them beyond 2 hours on a Thursday evening and the records I reviewed in the course of the case. But they exist in the world with their father's eyes and their mother's courage and the particular circumstances that no child creates for themselves, and I made my decisions with that fact in the room. That, too, is analytical. But it is the kind that Aunt Cecile taught me, not the kind Marcus tried to use against me. The kind that accounts for the human cost of a calculation, not just the numbers. Here's what happened after. I want to add one more thing about the marriage itself, because this is a story about a woman discovering betrayal, and I have been telling it primarily as a story about documentation, and those two things are not actually separate. The documentation was the way I processed the betrayal. That is the honest account. Some people process grief through crying, or through conversation, or through the particular chaos of a life disrupted and then rebuilt from the pieces. I processed it through work, through the discipline of attention, through the act of building a record that was true when everything around me was false. I loved Marcus. I want to say that plainly because leaving it out would be a different kind of dishonesty. I had loved him for 9 years in the specific way of a person who is not naturally inclined toward emotional display and who therefore loves, when she loves, very completely and very privately. I had loved the version of him I had been given, which was the version he had managed carefully enough that I had not yet had sufficient data to question it. When I found the first anomaly, I did not immediately open a ledger. I sat on the edge of the bed at 11:30 at night and felt the specific cellular recalibration of a person whose body has understood something before their mind has caught up. I sat there for a long time. I did not cry. I thought about the $17 discrepancy and what it meant and what it was connected to and what I was going to do with the knowledge that something in the structure of my life was not what I had believed. And then I got up and found the ledger and wrote it down, because that is what I know how to do. That is the skill I have, the way of moving through difficulty that was given to me by my father and developed in 12 years of professional work and refined in 9 years of a marriage that it turned out had more in common with my professional cases than I had ever wanted to know. The grief was real. The analytical response to the grief was also real. They were not competing with each other. They were the same person doing the only thing she knew how to do with information that she could not unknow. I keep the ledger on my shelf because it is the record of the period in my life when I chose not to look away from something difficult and kept working anyway and built something true in the middle of something that was false. That is what precision is for, not coldness, not control, the courage to look clearly at the thing you would rather not see and to write it down anyway because the record is more important than your comfort. My father was an auditor. He taught me this. And it turned out that the most important case I ever worked was the one I built on my own kitchen table with a small blue ledger and 9 years of a marriage that deserved a more accurate accounting than it had been given. The divorce took 14 months. It was not friendly, but it was not dramatic either because the documentation was what it was, and the documentation said everything that needed to be said. My attorney described it as one of the cleanest financial cases she had ever worked, because every number I had given her was correct, and every number his attorney disputed I could source to a primary document. He settled in the 11th month. The terms included my share of the Chattanooga property, the full restoration of the transferred funds, and a division of the retirement accounts that reflected their actual rather than their reported value. The total came to slightly more than the $312,000 I had documented, because his attorney had made the mistake of pushing back on 3 items that my documentation proved conclusively, and the judge had not been sympathetic to a man whose forensic accountant wife had produced 12 months of primary source evidence. I do not feel triumphant about this. I want to be honest about that because this is an honest story. Triumph would require that winning the numbers felt like winning the thing. What I lost was a 9-year marriage and the version of my life I had believed I was building inside it, and no amount of correct documentation gives those back. What the documentation gave me was agency, the difference between being a woman to whom something is done and a woman who decides what happens next. That is not a small thing. Daphne and I are not friends. I want to be clear about that, because the narrative that women in our position become friends is appealing and is usually not true. We are 2 people who were deceived by the same man and who treated each other with the basic decency that the situation deserved. She found an attorney. She pursued her own separate legal action regarding the Chattanooga property, which was relevant to her children's housing situation and which she was right to pursue. The last I heard, the matter was being resolved in her favor. She texted me once, 6 months after the Thursday evening. 3 words, "Thank you, really." I replied, "You did the hard part, you knocked on the door." She had. I have never underestimated what that cost. Cecile came to Knoxville the month the divorce was final, and we went to dinner and she ordered a bottle of wine and looked at me across the table with the expression she has always worn when she is both proud of me and sad about what the pride cost. "You knew for 8 months," she said. "Yes. That's a long time to know something and say nothing. It was a long time to make sure I had everything I needed before I said it," I said. "There's a difference." She raised her glass. "Your father would have said the same thing. My father had been an auditor. He had died when I was 19, and I had inherited from him the particular love of a number that tells the truth when everything else is ambiguous. He had also left me the knowledge, the hard and specific knowledge that comes from watching a careful person do careful work. That precision is not coldness, that paying attention is not the same as being unable to feel, that the most powerful thing you can do when someone is trying to rewrite your reality is to keep a record of the real one. I keep the blue ledger. On my bookshelf now. Finished. Closed. 12 years into my career and 8 months of a marriage's end in its pages. I do not open it often, but I keep it where I can see it, because it is the record of a period of my life during which I was told, repeatedly and by a man who was supposed to know me, that the way I think is a defect. The ledger disagrees. I have taken on 2 new clients since the divorce. One is a woman in Knoxville who suspects her husband is hiding assets in anticipation of a separation. The other is a business owner in Nashville whose partner has been moving funds in a pattern that the partner's own accountant missed. I find things. That is my job. That is what I am. And the man who spent 9 years suggesting that the way I think makes me difficult has simply become the most instructive case in my professional history. You're too analytical, June. You overthink everything. No. I think correctly. I document thoroughly. I close cases before I open doors. And when someone rings my doorbell with information I already have, I put the kettle on. That's my story. 8 months of a ledger, 1 Thursday doorbell, and a man who should have known better than to maintain a double life with a forensic accountant. If this reminded you that your precision is not a flaw, that paying attention is not the same as overthinking, that the way you process the world is a gift and not a problem, take that as your sign. Share this with someone who needed to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.